Thank you. So, one piece of evidence we have from today's panel is that the Bush campaign is still paying its campaign staff because they have been contributing mightily to the Twitter feed, not necessarily picking up on the points that are made up here, but nonetheless promoting the. But unfortunately, when Matt started, Matt's our secret weapon because he talks so fast that by the time you've actually finished composing your Twitter piece, he's at 6 points down the line. So there was a sudden drop-off in tweets during Matt's presentation. But let me start by asking all of you, I think, a question about something which has been in the news recently with regard to Florida, which is the Florida superintendents making a rather public statement, a disavowal of the accountability system in Florida, and saying that indeed they have no confidence in that system, which certainly goes to speak to some of what we've discussed here today. So maybe if members of the panel would like to address that, and let me remind people here that if you have questions, write them down on index cards, and Vicki will come around and pick them up. And people out in the virtual world, including all of the Bush campaign staff, you can send in your questions via Twitter.
So, the superintendents have long said behind closed doors in Florida they don't like a lot of what's happening. For them to come out, but they've been afraid. I mean, that's really what it's been. They've been afraid of the Department of Education and sanctions that might be taken against their districts. So for them to actually finally come out, I think, is huge and very powerful. Teachers and parents and many school boards in Florida and a lot of people who care about public education have long been saying that these policies are bad for kids. And I want to point something out that often gets overlooked. I would say that nothing happens in Florida in regards to education that Jeb Bush's foundation doesn't have its fingerprints on, even today. That his foundation is very active in the legislative process in Florida. They have groups out there that are active in the political process in Florida in electing candidates. So the influence that Jeb Bush has even today on public education in Florida is pretty significant. And a couple other points I wanted to make that I think are important. You heard comments earlier by Sherman as well as Matt about pre-K and class size. Those were voter initiatives because voters in Florida were not happy with what was happening in public education. And class size was actually a way for voters to say, public education matters so much to us, we're going to force the issue of reducing class size. Governor Bush tried every which way, including bringing the measure back to voters, to get the class size amendment undone, and has not been successful. So I think it's important to remember that. And then, as was mentioned also, this notion of the focus on testing and the impacts that it has. In Florida, you often hear people talk about what gets tested is where all the resources go. So our music and arts programs, our electives programs tend to suffer because they're not tested. And scary to me as a music teacher is that the Music Association in the state of Florida actually came out at one point saying, well, maybe we should develop an FCAT-like test for music so that music would become important again. And then the last caveat I'd like to point out, too, in all of this conversation is the issue of teacher shortages. So when Jeb Bush was leaving office, the economy was starting to slow, things were starting to happen, but we had high turnover, and now we're really seeing an issue in Florida with the need to fill positions. In my district alone, which has about 4,500 teachers, we've hired over 1,700 teachers in the last 3 years alone. And many of the teachers who are leaving are newer teachers. They're not staying in the profession. So it's not just people retiring now, it's also newer teachers. So these are some serious challenges that school districts face.
Okay. So with regard to the superintendents, these are the county level superintendents. Collective statement of concern about the accountability system. This happens on occasion, but how it plays out has varied. In 1999-2000, a couple of school boards were considering lawsuits specifically about the bonuses as being imposed by the legislature and as a violation of the constitutional prerogatives of local school boards. The St. Pete Times, now the Tampa Bay Times, reported that the chair of the Pinellas School Board was told very gently, we would like to work with you, but it's very difficult if you're going to sue us. And so the Pinellas County School Board and a number of other school boards backed off. Governor Bush talks about his willingness to work across the aisle and to work with various partners. At least with regard to relationships with teachers, he had a very prickly one. As far as I am aware, I know that he never picked up the phone to call Andy Ford, who was the Florida Education Association president for the second half of the Bush administration. I would bet that he never picked up the phone or responded to Andy's predecessor, Maureen Dinnan, as head of the FEA. In 2006, there actually was a similar sort of move, in part in response to a basically failure of competence on the third grade reading tests in 2006. And the interim superintendent interim commissioner of education put together a task force, and while the task force was putatively about the third grade reading tests, it turned into a vehicle for superintendents both on and off that panel to nudge the grading system. Given the political success of the A through F grading system, which I mentioned before, what they were negotiating about in reality was what would be the criteria for high schools, because high schools had generally been no higher than a C for the vast bulk of high schools up until 2006. And that changed after Governor Bush left office. So the distribution of grades in high schools, which were the major political concern of county superintendents, was what they started to nudge. And so I think that what we're seeing here is, on occasion, in any state, you can see sort of concerns bubble up, and the question, and I don't know what the effect is going to be in Florida this time around.
I would just add quickly, that as Sherman says, this happens, and it's not just superintendents, by the way. It's also in many cases principals and of course teachers that don't like these test-based accountability systems. I think that on the one hand, people are sometimes too quick to just dismiss that with the kind of mindset, well, people are being held accountable, never like the way they're being held accountable, right? They don't want to be held accountable. On the other hand, I think that maybe there may be a grain of truth in that, but I think that it's a huge mistake to ignore the basic fact, 101, that accountability systems are, about changing behavior. If it's not like you're giving, if you give a student a gold star or put their name on the bulletin board, if there are even still bulletin boards, I'm really not sure. There may just be big widescreen TVs that suffice as bulletin boards. But, if the kid, you do that because the kid reacts positively. Same thing with accountability systems. They're about changing behavior, and you can get negative behavioral changes in terms of what teachers, principals, superintendents do in terms of policy, teacher retention, teacher recruitment, and so on and so forth. So you have to, strike this balance between a good design and buy-in, but you ignore the latter at your peril.
Good. So the first question is from someone who graduated from a Manatee County Public High School a few years ago, and they ask, could you propose alternative models or programs of reform that you believe would have a more positive impact on children than those that we've been discussing here?
Yeah, I'd start out by empowering the parents and the teachers in the schools, the people who are on the front lines on a regular basis. One thing that I think no one has said yet in this conversation is that educators and parents, quite honestly, were not part of the education reform movement in the state of Florida that the Bush administration pushed. I think it's a lot about priorities. As I said earlier, there's an awful lot of money spent on testing. In my school district, which has about 62,000 students, over the last few years, the only technology that has been bought practically has been computers strictly for testing. These computers are not used for anything else. In fact, the average age of a computer for our teachers in our schools is about 8 years, which in computer years, is like 10,000 years old. So the equipment we're using is so antiquated because the money has really been funneled away from really being able to have interactive and exciting lessons to this notion of we've got to have everything we need to make sure we can test these kids, which, by the way, hasn't worked because the systems continue to crash in Florida.
So that you don't have to buy a book that I wrote about 8 years ago and that Leo complained about the price of at the time. The gist that I think is that it is fine to use relatively objective indicators as screening. So if you want to have tests and use those as screens for looking at a smaller set of schools more closely, I think that's fine. The problem that we see in Florida's A through F system in No Child Left Behind is a very technocratic, rigid, formulaic approach. The second thing is something akin to what Andy said. Some states use a grand jury system for not just sort of indicting criminals, but doing civil fact finding. And I think it would be fine for part of the accountability structure to be local, using something like a grand jury system and paneling a grand jury to take a look at the equity opportunities in local school districts and local schools. That would be independent of school districts, be locally based on citizens supported by an independent structure. When we don't have that, when we have something that's formulaic and top-down, that's when you see something that the Tampa Bay Times reported about Pinellas County schools, where the move away from court-ordered desegregation left 5 schools highly segregated and with absolutely terrifying outcomes for children. Florida's A through F system failed those children. Technocratic accountability did nothing for them. What's needed is something like the power of a local grand jury to be able to do fact-finding backed up by subpoenas that's controlled by local citizens.
Again, I will answer this question quickly and follow Sherman up. I think that screening with test results is a great idea. Of course, I think that building on that, everybody says this, but you can't say it enough. There have to be other accountability measures beyond these state tests. And this is, I think, something that needs to happen as soon as possible, and progress needs to be made. And if I were a foundation, I would be putting a lot of money into it. For the record, I'm not a foundation. I also think that when Sherman said, if we kind of jokingly go in the opposite direction, that things are overly technocratic, I might be actually a little more technocratic in this response, which is to say that I would actually make some changes to the way that these grades are calculated. In Florida, they are common problems throughout the nation, but they are quite acute in Florida, and under the banner of fairness, the way that they calculate those grades could use a great deal of work, specifically in the way that they penalize students, schools and districts based on the characteristics of the students that they serve, rather than their actual effectiveness in helping those students improve.
Okay, we have a question. Since Mr. Bush's foundation seems to have its hand in all that affects public education in Florida, to what degree could we see these reforms as an effort to privatize public education?
Well, I actually, personally, I think that's kind of been what the intent has been, is to set schools up for failure. I want to say that, you can talk to almost any teacher in the state of Florida who's in our public school system, and they'll tell you that they don't support these reforms. And they don't support these reforms because they really do feel it's shortchanging our kids. And one of the things we often do talk about in Florida is that a lot of these decisions seem to be profit-minded. How best to profit off of kids. And so, even with the testing, it's this moving target every year. We never know. I mean, literally, this test that was given this year, which has really got the superintendents going as well, but this test that was given this year was not even validated before the students took it. And as I said earlier, the passing score wasn't even set until after the results were in. It is clearly not geared towards helping students be successful. And that's what I think I find frustrating, I think any teacher would find frustrating, is that you want the best for your kids, but there are so many obstacles and so many curveballs thrown at you on a regular basis, you can't help but wonder if this isn't all about setting kids up and systems up for failure, so that ultimately it can be privatized. It sets a narrative to allow for the privatization of public education.
When I was in Florida, in University of South Florida, I was an activist in the United Faculty of Florida, and we had sort of a saying. The Florida legislature is a part-time legislature. It comes into session in March for 60 days, and we used to say there's no accident that the Florida legislature comes back to Tallahassee during Colonoscopy Awareness Month. Having said that, I disagree with Andy and with a number of my former colleagues and those concerned about and critics of Florida education policy. While I think there is a private preference orientation to Jeb Bush, and while certainly when he was governor, he was largely inattentive to problems when he outsourced a number of state functions, for example, with private prisons. I think the Foundation for Florida's Future, and similar allies understand that the vast majority of students are going to be in public schools for the foreseeable future. While they might move, like a number of other reformers from both parties, towards a much more private-oriented approach for large cities, where they can make political moves. I think what's probably more important to focus on is the assumption that badly designed markets in education are better than almost anything involving local public schools. That is probably the key mindset that is true. It's okay to have double standards where voucher schools in Florida have no real accountability in the same way that local public schools, because badly designed markets are better than almost anything else. It's perfectly fine to have mediocre contracting of state testing that will determine the opportunities for children in high school and the careers of teachers, because badly designed markets are better than almost anything else in public education. And I think that's sort of probably the way that the sort of what I've seen over the last 15 years.
More ideological than economic.
I mean, like, yeah, there's, let me put it this way. There's a huge amount of money to be made if you can get a contract with a state. But that's actually not that much money. There's probably a lot more money to be made if you build schools and construction in areas that are growing. But it's sort of that mindset that badly designed markets are better than public education.
I would echo what my very learned, able, and distinguished colleague said. I do think that there is a contingent that seeks what is often called privatization. I think probably it's more likely that they just seek a significant share of private schools to compete with public schools. And in some cases, they want the whole thing to be private. But I think that that may be a minority in the quote-unquote reform community. I think that most of the folks there just want to, introduce some competition and some policies that are traditionally associated with the private sector into schools. And I think that they recognize that most parents, most kids go to public schools that are doing just fine, and that most parents are generally satisfied with the schools that their children attend.
What evidence is there, if any, on the effect of class size on Florida education and the class size initiative?
I don't know that there's really been any formal research on it that I can think of. I will tell you that, as I said earlier, there's been attempt after attempt after attempt to undermine the class size. And in fact, a father from South Florida filed a lawsuit, I think the week before last, because class size is really not being followed as it was intended. It has been so watered down that even though it says that core classrooms should have no more than 18 students in grades K through 3 and no more than 22 students in grades 4 through 8 and no more than 25 students at the high school level, most of our classrooms in the state of Florida are over those numbers now, and in some cases pretty significantly. And so it's probably hard to tell at this point, and I'm not aware of any study. I mean, anecdotally, teachers feel that they have more time to spend with kids one-on-one.
I actually think there was a very important short-term effect of the class size amendment. Those of you who are political junkies in Florida will remember that it was sponsored and pushed from South Florida. The state legislature had underfunded school construction in South Florida for a number of years, and one of the requirements in effect of the 2002 class size initiative is it required that the state legislature fund construction to help meet the class size targets. And that pushed a lot of funding down to South Florida, especially Miami-Dade schools, which otherwise, because of land market values, at least before climate change and sea level rise, was certainly affecting and crimping the capacity of the schools there to build to meet the burgeoning population.
I don't have any knowledge off the top of my head about class size studies specific to Florida. My guess is most likely if such evidence exists, it's generally consistent with the evidence elsewhere, which is that class size reduction does confer a test-based benefit, but it does require significant reduction, and of course hiring more teachers is a very expensive investment, and that is very salient. Particularly while resources are low, not that I'm saying resources have to be low, but while resources are low, that's a significant investment of money that you have to make to get that benefit. And many people argue, of course, that you could spend less and get better results elsewhere. That supposition is still under, unfolding now with a lot of the stuff that's happening recently.
Okay, so it took a little bit of time. I guess it wasn't in the talking points, but we finally have a question from Twitter. And the question is, what about well-designed markets? Is a well-designed market possible? And if so, how do we build one?
Sherman?
So I'm trying to remember the name of the economist who helped the Boston schools design their high school choice market inside the Boston public schools. It's the same economist who helped design the med school residency matching program in the United States. I'm blanking on his name. But essentially, education is not like a commodities market. Those people who talk about choice going back to Chubb and Moe in 1988 and Milton Friedman long before, treat education like a commodity market, and that isn't. Children are individual, families are individual. It's much more like, markets where money doesn't change hands at all, like transplants and or the choice systems inside Boston Public Schools. So there are actually examples of carefully designed sort of what economists could call market structures even without vouchers. And in public choice systems, whether you're talking about Spanish Harlem back in the old days of the early 1980s with the community district choice in, I think it was Community District 2, if I remember right. But there are ways to construct it that are really very, very different from the talking points of voucher proponents.
So isn't one of the issues how well regulated a market is?
I mean, yeah.
And so, if you start from the presupposition that regulation of a market is a bad thing, and so that you want your markets to be as unregulated as possible, like in the Florida voucher system.
That's right. And like that's so. For example, a couple years ago, some of our friends elsewhere in the district at the Fordham Institute were pushing a sort of scaled accountability model for vouchers, that the more money that a school was receiving from vouchers, maybe the more it should have to mirror the accountability system for local public schools. They got pushback quite a bit, I think about 15 to 24 months ago, and I haven't heard that argument in the last year or two. And that's exactly, especially with people who've pushed the neo-vouchers in Nevada, that's sort of the argument. Let it be unfettered. A regulated market is a bad thing. And my sort of view is that sounds like, for those who've heard the term about sector agnosticism, it's like we want to be sector agnostic, but not too agnostic. Double standards are a good thing. We should hold public schools to a higher standard than voucher schools, which if you're a public school teacher, you might think, oh, okay, except when it comes to the concrete effects of it. Those who receive public, direct or indirect public funding, from my point as a citizen and as a parent, should be held to the same rough general expectations. If you receive funding to educate my child or my neighbor's child, I want you to teach them good science. I want you to teach them to read. And for markets to be very badly designed, unregulated, we're essentially giving money. We know that the state of Louisiana is giving millions of dollars to schools that teach horrible science, that do not teach well-founded science. And that's very clearly a double standard and a deliberately badly designed market.
This is a question that basically is asking about how the effects of these reforms are playing out. And are schools that are particularly focused on testing and test prep, do they have a different demographic of students than other students? Does this play out differently in schools in affluent communities and in schools serving communities with high rates of poverty?
So I can tell you, based on the FSA results that just came back in, which this year did not include growth because it's the first year the test was administered. So there's no growth model to this test yet. In our district, we've looked at the results, and our highest poverty schools had the highest failure rates. And it was almost identical. In fact, the highest failure rate in our school district was an elementary school that has 97% of its students on free lunch. And you can almost go right down the order. Our lowest failure rates in our schools were the schools that are in our most affluent areas. And so I think that's been a big frustration for teachers throughout. And now with this increased so-called accountability, on teachers now where test scores are tied to their evaluations. It's becoming harder and harder to staff those schools. And I think that should be a big concern because there's a penalty essentially associated with the fact that we aren't looking at kids as a whole. And that's not to say, and I'm going to say this now because I was looking over Leo's shoulder at Twitter, and the comment that was made, which is often made by the Foundation for Florida's Future, is that this should be about the students, not about the adults. And that's often what we hear. The problem is the adults in the classroom probably care more about the students than any of the other adults that are making these decisions, in my opinion. And so what happens in that scenario is that what teachers are constantly fighting for is for their kids. And they call them their kids for a reason. And they're always fighting for their kids. And whenever they stand up and speak, the response always is, this isn't about you, this is about kids. And that's the way to deflect the fact that they don't want teacher input in this conversation, who are the experts in the classroom.
So, okay, you want to say
Oh,
something?
yeah, absolutely. Very quickly, golden rule. To whatever degree you hold schools, teachers, principals, superintendents accountable for how highly their students score versus how much progress those students make while they're attending the school, you will be penalizing schools and districts that serve larger proportions of disadvantaged students. All right? Now, Florida's grading system, this year aside because they've switched the test so they can't use growth, is better than those states where they're basically just using proficiency rates, which is purely how highly students are scoring. And some states are still doing that. In recent years, a lot of states have moved to what is very much modeled after Florida's system, which is this mix of proficiency, how high students score, and various types of growth models. Florida's system in that kind of hierarchy is not even great. It's like among the worst of the best. All right, I'll put it that way. And to whatever degree you have schools held accountable for how highly their students score, you are going to put disadvantaged schools in the situation where they can't possibly get a high grade. And you're going to put schools serving large proportions of advantaged students in a situation where they basically can't get a low grade. And there are actually some states where mathematically, if you're above a certain proficiency rate, you simply can't get a D or an F. And so when the question being, if I recall, was is test-based pressure higher in kind of schools serving more disadvantaged populations? And I would say absolutely. And I think that that's something that can be addressed with better design systems.
Okay, so let's do one last question and call it a day. This question says, in the context of these push for taking a significant share of public resources and putting them into private schools, what can public systems, public schools do to recover and to fight back to help those students regain the learning opportunities that they are losing?
So I think we're starting to see that. And we're starting to see that in parents are really coming more to the forefront in the opt-out movement and in the notion of local control. I think it's kind of interesting, under the Bush administration in Florida and continuing today, there's been this notion that we should relax rules for charter schools. We should have no real accountability measures for those who may get vouchers, but we've actually increased regulation in our public schools. Less and less decisions are made at the local level, and more decisions are made at the higher level. We've been pushing in our district, and I think this is true throughout Florida, for the notion of teachers need to be part of the conversation. Teachers and parents know what is best for students. And so even yesterday when I was speaking to our school board, this whole notion of professional development, that was one of the other things that happened in Florida over the last 15 years or so, has been this focus on mandating professional development, not good professional development, just professional development. And our push has been on this notion of professional learning. There's such a notion of documenting everything, showing everything, proving everything, as opposed to really looking at what works. So what we're trying to encourage is an opportunity for teachers to be able to get together and talk to each other. I mean, when we look at countries throughout the world that have been ultimately, and incredibly successful, they've done it because they've entrusted the professionals to be able to work with each other. They give them the time and the opportunity to sit down and talk about what works, what challenges lie ahead. We don't give that opportunity. There's so much focus on data and making sure that's all we're looking at is data. We never talk about how to react to the data and what strategies really work and what might work in your classroom doesn't work in my classroom, and why is that? And those are the kinds of conversations that I think need to happen if we're truly going to talk about focusing on students and improving students' learning. Then they should be the center of our conversation, not test scores.
I am not competent to serve as a consultant for any local public school system. However, I do have a sense of reality in answer to sort of the question, which is what do local school systems do in response to choice, which is you already get the dissatisfied customers back from voucher schools, from other private schools, from charter schools. You do get them back. You already know that. If you don't know that, talk to your principals, talk to your teachers. So what the effect of many charter systems, not all, and certainly a lot of voucher programs, is that you are going to get the more needy population implicitly, if not in the initial enrollment in non-local public schools, certainly in the attrition of schools returning back, of students returning back to local public schools. That's always going to be the case.
In terms of fighting back against, I believe the question was more general, not just choice, but kind of these market-based reforms in general. Again, I too am not qualified to serve as a consultant, really for anything, not just for a public school district. But one thing that I often wish would come out of both kind of quote-unquote sides is this attitude of, not all of this stuff is unreasonable. A lot of it makes good sense. It's not unreasonable to hold schools accountable. It's frankly, in my personal opinion, not a teacher, it's not unreasonable to have a moderate, healthy dose of test-based accountability if it's done correctly. And to acknowledge this on both sides, saying that your demands aren't unreasonable, my demands aren't unreasonable. I think that there's a tremendous amount of room for middle ground in education. I think probably people in other policy areas say this all the time, and they never find it, and so I am looking forward to a life of disillusionment, and I'm well prepared for it. But if you could just meet in that middle ground, I think that both sides at this point are so afraid of rollback or the other side rolling forward that there's no trust. But a lot of these things sound reasonable to me, and I'd like to see that attitude going forward.
So we did have a question on Twitter from someone who wasn't part of Bush campaign staff, which was, please tell me this discussion will be available on the web for later viewing, and indeed it will be. As the presidential campaign goes on and the empire and the Republican Party marshals its forces to strike back, if Jeb Bush is the beneficiary of that, you can come back here and see a full discussion of the education reforms under his governorship. I'd like to thank Andrew and Sherman and our very own Matt for their contributions to today's panel. And I'd like to thank all of you for either appearing in person or checking in on our live streaming.